Okay, team, so we got witnesses that say that the attacker was a kobold.
All right, so we're looking for a small anthropomorphic dog creature.
No. Kobolds are like rodent folk.
No, you're both wrong. Kobolds are small gnome-like forest spirits.
Oh boy. Better put a pot of coffee on. Looks like it's gonna be a long night. Everything's flying at you really fast, and there's lots of video game stuff, but this time it's about D&D, and there's D&D monsters. Maybe Vecna's left-handed, I don't know, but this is Puckin' Talk. Hello, Internet, and welcome to Puckin' Talk, the show where I'm Puck, and I'm gonna talk. Alright, look, I don't have Matt Pat's charisma or talent or budget, but what I do have are a number of questions about kobolds, and I gotta believe I'm not the only one. Kobolds are weird creatures, right? It's like goblins that aren't goblins. Stranger still, it seems like there's a wide variety of kobolds with no clear through line on where they came from. Most of your average fantasy creatures have a kind of consistency on how they look from iteration to iteration, going back from their original folklore origins to whatever Tolkien reimaginings there are, and then onward into anything modern that exists in the world these days. Some great examples, goblins. Goblins are always kind of like short, tricky humanoids with pointy noses and ears. They vary in color from red to yellow to green. Orcs are usually powerful, muscular humanoids with big tusks who like to fight. Dragons are dragons. There's a couple different varieties, but most people recognize all the varieties as dragons. Kobolds, by comparison, are kind of all over the place. For example, everything I'm showing you on the screen here is a kobold. So how did we get here? Well, starting from German folklore, kobolds were small, invisible spirits. They more closely resembled gnomes or goblins. They resided in houses, mines, and ships for some reason. So right from the start, kobolds have a depiction that overlaps with a lot of popular fantasy races or creatures. So it's already something difficult to use, so it's ripe for a complete reimagining. And by all accounts, as soon as it started to be adapted into other forms of media, it was immediately reimagined, with the exception of Clash of Clans, which has the most folklore-accurate depiction of a kobold of any other medium that I have seen, which makes sense because Clash of Clans is a Finnish game and shares a lot of folklore with ancient German. That being said, Dungeons & Dragons comes out in 1974, and kobolds were described as dog-like creatures. At least that's what everybody says. But it's not true. It's actually a lie. The early descriptions of kobolds in the monster manuals are just a few sentences long, and don't mention the word dog at all, occasionally describing their smell as smelling like a dog. That's it. And they make sounds called yip-yapping, which yip-yapping was a language in Dungeons & Dragons original. That's a fun little tidbit. But there's no dog-like descriptions in the monster manuals. It doesn't exist. I believe where dog-like comes from is people's descriptions of the images from the early Dungeons & Dragons Advanced Monster Manuals, which is easy to see. I could easily look at this and say this is dog-like, and it's kind of easy to abstract because the image is very abstract, this basic black and white. It's difficult to tell what is armor or what is part of the creature, and so you're left to a lot of your imagination as far as how the creature would look in a physical sense. But we'll get back to this later. Truly dog-like kobolds, if we're talking about dog-like kobolds, are primarily found in anime and manga adaptations of fantasy settings. These creatures are very dog-like. They look closer to werewolves or just straight up anthropomorphic dogs. But here we have an outlier with Sword Art Online, which Sword Art Online bucks the trend of the dog-like kobold and has kobolds that more closely resemble the 5e or the 4e designs of kobolds. Also 3.5e if you want to get tricky with it. However, in video games, we get a completely different story altogether, as video game kobolds are almost exclusively rodent-like, without the aforementioned exception of Clash of Clans. And then finally, we get to our Dungeons & Dragons kobolds. Funny little lizards who love dragons. Again, how did we get here? How did we go from a German folklore sprite to a scaly dog creature, to full dog creatures, to rodent folk, and finally dragon-loving reptiles? And why is the very specific divide between medium? Why are video game kobolds rodents? Why are manga kobolds dogmen? Why are tabletop gaming kobolds lizards? These are the questions that keep me up at night. So I started to dig into it, starting with the original folklore. I think we can put this folklore version on the shelf, as it seems to only be used in Clash of Clans, which, makes sense. Again, Supercell is a Finnish company, and there's a lot of common folklore in that region. It's likely it was adapted from the original German. Next up, we have our original D&D kobolds. Ah, man. The original depictions don't say a lot about the appearance. If you go back to the original Dungeons & Dragons Advanced Monster Manual, which I purchased on DM's Guild, and you can yourself, the description doesn't say much. It just says that there's simple creatures that attack in packs. There's not a lot about the physical description. It relies heavily on the art piece. And as you can see, the art piece, again, a very basic black and white image, widely open to interpretation. It's difficult to tell what's armor and what's skin. There's just not a lot that you can pull from this, and it leaves a lot to your imagination. There's a couple other depictions in the manual, but again, it's hard to glean. The picture's kind of a mess. No offense to the first artists of these kind of things. You guys worked with what you had. But we can come back to this. So, dogfolk. Let's talk about dogfolk. Dogfolk appear almost exclusively in manga and anime. Earliest record I could find of dogfolk kobolds was in the novel Record of the Lotus War that was later adapted into an anime series by the same name. So when we take a closer look at Record of the Lotus War, you notice that a lot of anime fantasy tropes and trends, and there's definitely something influential here. A brief search reveals that the original author, Ryo Mizuno, based the story on previous work that he did with a tabletop RPG, a Japanese tabletop RPG, called Sword World RPG. Sword World RPG makes all the pieces fall into place, and it kind of blew my mind. So many things make sense now. I love anime, and fantasy anime has always felt really D&D, but something's always been just a little bit off. There's always been these slight changes. And I'm telling you, Sword World RPG is the solution. So I wanted to see if I could get my hands on a translated copy of the original Sword World RPG books, and turns out I couldn't do it. But I did find a community that has translated the book. They put it all on a wiki, and you can actually read it there. I'll put the link in the description. And I went through the wiki, and the kobold in the wiki is described as a dog man. It is listed in a group of creatures that are known as bestial creatures. However, there were no images in the wiki. A couple more searches managed to track down this image. And through matching up the stats on the page with what is in the translated version of the Sword World RPG wiki, I can safely say this is the kobold depiction the book gives you. And if anybody has a copy of the original Sword World RPG book, go check it out. If you can find somebody that's got it, post it. I will happily put it up. But this is it. This is the dog kobold. This is where it came from. This is the first dog kobold from which all other dog kobolds in anime derive. This is the first one to ever exist. Dungeons & Dragons was first translated in Japan in 1985, and Sword World RPG came out 4 years later in 1989, and the dogmen kobolds were born. Now, this is all just a theory, but as much as I dug into it, I couldn't find any dog-faced kobolds or any dog kobolds before this point. So I'm confident that this is where the anime cute doggo kobolds come from. And I would love to ask Ryo Mizuno where his idea to make kobolds dog-like came from, because he's actually still writing and he's active on Twitter. I can put the link in the description as well. But I don't know enough Japanese to have this conversation. So if anyone knows enough Japanese and would like to ask Ryo Mizuno where the idea for dog-faced kobolds came from, I highly recommend doing it, because I would love to know. Hello everyone, FuturePuck here, just chiming in while I was busy editing this page. A bit of new information came up while I was going through this. A little bit of a theory, not much evidence to support it, but I figured I'd include it anyways. So while I was editing the video, I happened to notice on the PDF copy of the first edition Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual I acquired, if you turn to page 57, where the kobold information is, on what would have been the left page of that, page 56, is this image of the jackalware. And this image of the jackalware is almost one-to-one what the earliest depictions of the Doglike Kobolds look like in Record of the Lotus War and in Sword World RPG. I'm going to put the images side by side so you can see. It's not difficult to imagine an artist between 1985 and 1989 being handed a Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual with pages 56 and 57 bookmarked and told to interpret the image on the page, and then perhaps just selecting the wrong image entirely to reproduce art. Again, I have no evidence to support this, but when I saw the original image of the jackalware next to the image of the Record of the Lotus War and the Sword World RPG kobolds, man, they look real similar. Anyways, back to the video. Next up, rodents. Rodent kobolds are a little stranger. They came out a little bit later, and they're seemingly restricted to video games. They can be found in Final Fantasy, in the Heroes of Might and Magic series, and most notably in Warcraft. It's possible and likely that the creation of the rodent kobold design was popularized by Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft. And that is because the very first rodent kobold depiction that was ever put out in a video game or in any other media is believed to have been in Warcraft 3 in 2002. However, another image that is open to interpretation is this one, which came from the Dungeons & Dragons Advanced 2nd Edition Introduction book, and the art is by Tony Dieterlizzi. God, I hope I pronounced that correctly. And it was published in 1995. So, again, 7 years earlier. And it's easy to see the correlation between these two images. There appears to be a lot of similarities. Now, naturally, I wanted to get down to the bottom of this. I looked up who is the artistic director for Warcraft 3. And it turns out his name is Samwise Didier. God, these names. I'm terrible with names and I apologize. He's the artistic director for Warcraft 3. He's active on Twitter. He actually had his DMs open. So I sent him a message. And I asked him, saying, hey, where did you get the inspiration for the rodent kobolds? Thinking that I would find my smoking gun and my connection to this 2nd edition art piece that made the birth of the rodent kobolds throughout the video game verse. So I asked him. And he proceeded to sink my entire theory like a Russian flagship. He stated simply that he wanted to take a different direction with the look of the kobolds and decided to make them like rat people, rodent people. Very well. It seems the inception of the rodent kobolds will remain a bit of a mystery, be it conscious influence or coincidence, but it's clear that you can draw a line between the original artwork by Tony Dieterlizzi in 1999, all the way up to the rodent depictions of kobolds that we see today in Warcraft and Final Fantasy and Heroes of Might and Magic series. So, where it actually came from, I suppose, remains to be seen. But regardless of the specific influences of the original Dungeons & Dragons kobold art through the years, it's clear to see that in various iterations, kobolds have spread to anime and video games, and it seems that each branch in the journey of our well-known scaly dragon lovers has created a new version for people to enjoy that endures to this day. And personally, I am excited to see what new versions of the kobolds kick off in new mediums in the future. You know, be it dogmen, rodents, or our lovable scaly boys. I can only imagine what new ones are to come. But hey, that's just a talk, and a puck in talk. Thanks for watching.